The morning Hazel Brooks walked into Iron Ridge Ranch, she wasn't looking for trouble. Trouble had already found her plenty of times without any invitation. She came through the gate with a canvas bag over one shoulder and her mother's cookbook tucked under her arm like it was the only thing worth protecting in this world. Because it was. The snow was coming down sideways, the kind that gets into your collar and doesn't apologize. Her boots were wrong for the weather. Her coat was a size too small and had been since the previous winter. And before she could even reach the cookhouse door, a man stepped out of the barn and looked her up and down with the particular kind of contempt that doesn't bother to hide itself. His name was Dale Cruz, though Hazel didn't know that yet. He was the kind of man who laughed first and thought later, if he bothered to think at all. He looked at her round face red from cold, at the way her coat strained at the buttons, at the snow collecting on her shoulders because she hadn't moved fast enough to get out of it. And he opened his mouth. "Lord have mercy," he said, loud enough for the two men behind him to hear. "Ranch is looking for a cook, not a side of beef." The men laughed. One of them actually slapped his knee. Hazel stopped walking. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She stood in the snow with her mother's cookbook under her arm and her canvas bag on her shoulder, and she looked Dale Cruz in the eye for a long, steady moment, the kind of look that cost something to hold. Then she walked past him like he hadn't spoken at all. If you've ever been laughed at for something you couldn't change, you know exactly what that moment felt like. And if you haven't, stay with me, because this is a story about what happens after the laughter stops. Before we go any further, if you're new here, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel and hit that like button. Stories like Hazel's are what we do here, and every week there's something new that will stay with you long after it's over. Drop a comment and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, let's go back to Iron Ridge Ranch, and a woman the whole frontier was about to underestimate. The foreman's name was Clint Barrow, and he was not a cruel man, which made him, in some ways, more dangerous than Dale Cruz. Cruelty you can identify and prepare for. Clint Barrow's particular failing was indifference dressed up as fairness. He sat behind the desk in the ranch office, a drafty room that smelled of pipe tobacco and old leather, and looked at Hazel the way a man looks at a tool he's not sure he needs. "We had a cook," he said, "Pete Dunleavy. He broke his wrist 3 weeks ago, and we sent him back to his sister's place in Billings. Since then, it's been whoever draws the short straw heating beans over the fire." He paused. "The men are not in a good temper." "I imagine not," Hazel said. "You've cooked before? Professionally?" "Yes, sir." "Where?" She didn't hesitate, but she chose carefully. "Various establishments. Last 2 years in a kitchen in Butte. Before that, traveling work." Clint Barrow studied her. He was somewhere in his late 50s, with a mustache that had gone fully white and eyes that were neither warm nor cold, just watching. "You're young," he said, "and I'll be plain with you, Miss Brooks, Hazel Brooks. Miss Brooks." He folded his hands on the desk. "The men here are not easy. They work hard and they have opinions. Some of those opinions aren't fit for polite company. A woman in a camp kitchen is already an adjustment. A woman who—" He stopped himself and tried to find a diplomatic route. He didn't find one. "You'd be the only woman on this property. The work is physical. The hours are before dawn and after dark. The men will test you." "I know," Hazel said. "You say that like you've heard it before." "Because I have." He looked at her another moment. Outside, the wind knocked something loose on the roof and it rattled twice before going still. Hazel kept her hands in her lap and her spine straight and waited. "I'll give you one meal," Clint said finally. "Tonight's supper, 16 men. Whatever you can find in the stores. Pete left it in decent shape, but we've been through a stretch of bad weather and resupply's been delayed." He stood, which meant the conversation was closing. "You impress them. You've got the job through winter. You don't, I'll give you a fair day's wage and arrange transport to the nearest town." "One meal," Hazel said. "That's all I need." What she didn't tell him, what she had no reason to tell him yet, was that she had been cooking for difficult men in difficult conditions since she was 14 years old and standing on an overturned crate to reach her mother's stove. One meal was nothing. One meal was a breath. The cookhouse was at the far end of the main yard, separated from the bunkhouse by about 30 feet of open ground that the wind had apparently decided belonged to it. Hazel stood in the doorway and took stock of what she had. Cast iron range, wood burning, and someone had let the firebox go cold. 2 long prep tables, scarred with years of use. Pots and pans hanging on hooks. Not organized, just hung, like someone had run out of patience. A dry goods pantry that ran along the back wall. She started there. Beans, dried. A good quantity. Salt pork, not much, but workable. Potatoes, set. 2 sacks, she checked them quickly for soft spots and found more than she'd have liked, but enough. Flour, lard, dried onions. Some cornmeal in a tin that smelled fine when she opened it. A string of dried peppers hanging from a nail. At the very back of the bottom shelf, a jar of something dark and thick. She unscrewed the lid and smelled it. Molasses. Old, but fine. She closed the pantry and stood in the middle of the cookhouse and did what her mother had taught her to do before she ever picked up a spoon. She made a plan. The fire came first. She spent 20 minutes coaxing the range back to life, laying the tinder, feeding it carefully, not rushing it. A cold range is not an emergency, her mother used to say. A cold range is just a conversation you haven't started yet. By the time the iron began to warm under her hand, she had already decided on the menu. Beans, slow cooked with the salt pork and the molasses and the dried onions, seasoned with 2 of the peppers. Cornbread, 2 pans, golden on the bottom and soft in the middle. Boiled potatoes with the better ones she'd sorted out, mashed with lard and salt and whatever good she could coax out of them. And if the range held its heat through the afternoon, she'd do a pan gravy with the pork drippings. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't meant to be. It was meant to be the kind of meal that got into a man's bones after a day in the Montana cold and reminded him what it felt like to be cared for, even by accident. She had the beans on by 10 in the morning. Dale Cruz came by at noon, alone this time, no audience to perform for. He leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed and watched her stir the pot with an expression that was trying to be contempt, but kept sliding into curiosity. "Smells different than Pete's," he said. "That's the molasses," Hazel said without looking up. "Pete didn't use molasses." "I know." A pause. "How do you know what Pete used?" "Because I asked Clint what Pete cooked, and Clint said Pete mostly boiled things and called it done." She lifted the spoon, blew on it, tasted, added a small pinch more salt. "Boiling things and calling it done is fine when a man isn't cold. But these men are cold, and cold men need something with weight to it, something that sticks." Dale stared at her. She could feel him trying to find the angle for another comment and not quite locating it. "You're pretty confident for someone who hasn't proved anything yet," he said. "I'm not confident," Hazel said, and she finally looked at him. "I just know what I know. There's a difference." He left without responding, which was its own kind of answer. The afternoon passed in the rhythm she knew best, the rhythm of a kitchen working toward something. She moved between the range and the prep table in a pattern that looked, to anyone watching from outside, almost like a kind of dance, except not the graceful kind, the practical kind. The kind where you pivot because you have to, where you reach because the thing is there and you need it now, where your arms and back and feet are doing the calculation while your mind is free to plan the next step. She burned her wrist on the edge of the pan at 2 o'clock and swore under her breath and ran cold water over it and kept going. Her back started to ache around 3. She ignored it. The cornbread went in at 4, and by the time the light outside had gone from gray to that particular flat dark that only comes in Montana in January, the cookhouse smelled like something that had been cooked with actual intention. She heard the men coming before she saw them, boots on packed snow, low voices, the particular sound of a group of people who have lowered their expectations and are trying not to let it show. She had the pots on the table and the cornbread in the center and the gravy in a pitcher because she'd found one, and she had set out the tin plates herself so they didn't have to think about anything except sitting down. The first man through the door was big, not fat, just large in the way that some men are large, like the bones themselves decided to take up more space than average. He stopped when the smell hit him. Not a dramatic stop, just a half step, and then a stillness. Then he moved to the table. Hazel stood to the side and watched them come in. 12, 13, 14, 15, she counted. Clint came in last and caught her eye and gave nothing away. They served themselves. She'd left the ladle in the pot because she wasn't there to wait on them. She was there to feed them, which is a different thing. She listened to the sound of it, the spoons on the bowls, the first quiet that falls when people start eating before they've decided whether to talk. and then the different quality of quiet that comes when the food is good. She had learned long ago to tell the two apart. Dale Cruz looked up from his bowl at some point in the middle of the meal. She wasn't watching him directly, but she caught it from the corner of her eye. He looked at her, then back at his bowl, then he reached for a second piece of cornbread without saying anything. That was enough. Clint found her after, when the men had cleared out and she was washing up. "You've got the job," he said. "I know," she said. He almost smiled. Almost. "Don't get comfortable," he said, which was the closest thing to warmth she'd heard from him yet. What she didn't know, couldn't know, standing at that wash basin with her wrist still stinging and her back in open complaint, was that someone had been watching her all evening from the far end of the table. He hadn't laughed when Dale had made his comment in the yard. He hadn't said anything at all, not then and not at supper. He'd eaten his food quietly and watched the way she moved and listened to the sounds she made, the particular confidence of a person who knows their work. And he had thought something he wasn't ready to put into words yet. His name was Logan Mercer. He was 31 years old, had worked at Iron Ridge for 3 years, and was better with horses than he was with people, which suited him fine most of the time. He had gray eyes and a way of going still that made him easy to overlook in a room full of loud men, which was, he had found, a useful quality. He ate his beans and cornbread and said nothing and watched Hazel Brooks move through a kitchen that wasn't hers yet, like it had always been, and he filed the observation away somewhere he'd return to later. He didn't know, yet, why it mattered. She didn't know he existed. The first week was a study in how many ways a man can make his objections felt without actually saying anything. Dale Cruz scraped his plate loudly every single morning, a gesture that meant nothing nutritionally and everything socially. She was still here, and he was still registering his displeasure, and the scraping was the conversation they weren't having. 2 other men, a pair of younger cowboys named Tuck and Garrett, who seemed to operate as a single organism, made a habit of arriving late to meals, which forced her to hold the food warmer than was ideal and meant she couldn't start the cleanup as early. It wasn't organized. It was just the natural behavior of people who have decided not to like something and are expressing it in the only small ways available. She didn't adjust to them. She adjusted for the work. This was a distinction her mother had taught her, and one she had spent years learning the actual weight of. Adjusting to difficult people means letting them reshape you. Adjusting for the work means figuring out what the work needs and doing that. And if the difficult people are part of the work's conditions, then you account for them the same way you account for a cold morning or a low pantry. They are factors. They are not the point. The mornings were hardest. She was up before 4, banking the fire she'd kept low overnight, starting the coffee first because a ranch without coffee at dawn is a ranch full of men who haven't decided yet whether today is worth their effort. Then biscuits, because biscuits are not complicated if you know what you're doing, and they communicate something to a man that he can't quite articulate. That someone, somewhere, thought he was worth the 20 extra minutes. Eggs when there were eggs. Salt pork cut thin and fried in the pan drippings. Oatmeal on the cold days, which was most days, with the molasses because she believed in the molasses. By the end of the first week, the late arrivals had stopped arriving late. She noticed, but she didn't say anything. Saying something would have made it about them. Not saying something made it about the food, which was where she wanted it to be. Logan Mercer was always on time. She noticed that too, though she told herself she wasn't particularly keeping track. He sat at the end of the table nearest the door, which was the coldest seat, and he never complained about it, which meant either he didn't feel the cold or he felt it and decided it wasn't worth the energy of complaint. She couldn't tell which. He asked for second helpings only occasionally, and when he did, he brought his bowl to the pot himself instead of waiting for her to come to him. It was a small thing. She noticed it anyway. On the 9th day, she dropped an entire pot of gravy. Not because she was careless. The handle, she discovered when she picked it up, had a crack in it that had been there long before she arrived, and it chose that morning to finish the job. The gravy went across the floor in a slow, spreading disaster, and she stood in the middle of it with the broken handle in her hand and did what she always did in moments of actual crisis. She did not panic. She stood very still and looked at the mess and calculated the time to the breakfast bell and figured out what she could make instead with what she had. She was already moving toward the pantry when she heard the door. She didn't look up, assuming it was one of the men come early. "What do you need?" It was Logan Mercer's voice, quiet and direct without being warm. She looked up. He was standing in the doorway with his coat still on, looking at the gravy on the floor and then at her, and his expression was impossible to read. Not because it was cold, but because it was very, very careful. "I need to mop that up and start something else," she said. "I can mop." I was already looking around for the mop, found it leaning against the back wall where Pete had apparently left it, and where she'd left it too because she preferred to sweep, and the mop was Pete's system, not hers. "What are you making instead?" "Biscuit gravy if I can get a roux going in time." "White gravy, it's faster." He nodded and took the mop without further discussion. She had the roux started before he finished, and the gravy was ready before the bell, and no one knew it hadn't been the plan all along. Logan left before the men came in, quietly, the same way he'd arrived, and when she saw him at the breakfast table, he didn't look at her differently than he had before. He didn't look at her with expectation, which would have been worse. He just ate his biscuits with the white gravy and was quiet. She thought about that for the rest of the morning, in the spaces between the cooking. The first real test came at the end of the second week. Clint came to the cookhouse in the mid-afternoon, which was unusual. He was a man of fixed schedules, and mid-afternoons were when he did the books. "Resupply got delayed again," he said. "Weather took out the road between here and town. We've got maybe 4 days of stores at current consumption." He set a piece of paper on her prep table, a rough inventory he'd done himself. "Tell me what you need and I'll tell you what's impossible." She looked at the list. Then she looked at the pantry, running the numbers against what she already knew was in there. Then she looked at Clint. "How flexible are the men about what's on the table?" "They'll eat what's in front of them if it tastes like something," Clint said. "They won't eat what tastes like punishment." "Then we're fine," Hazel said. "I can stretch this 8 days, maybe 9, and they won't know they're being stretched." Clint regarded her. Pete would have said 5 days, 6 if he was being generous. "Pete boiled things and called it done," Hazel said. This time, Clint actually smiled. It was brief and it was small, and it rearranged his whole face while it lasted. "I'll leave it with you then, Miss Brooks." She worked it like a puzzle, which was the only way to work it. Every meal had to do more than the sum of its ingredients. A soup stretched with more liquid can still taste like a real soup if you build the flavor right. And flavor, she had learned, was largely about time and attention and a willingness to coax things. She made a pot of bean soup on the 3rd day that had less salt pork in it than the first week's beans but tasted richer because she'd rendered the fat out slowly and used it to build the base. She made cornmeal flatbreads instead of biscuits on the 4th day, seasoned with the last of the dried peppers, and served them with the potato and onion she had diced fine and cooked soft in the pan drippings. It was the kind of meal that a man raised on plenty might have called plain. It was the kind of meal that a man who understood difficult seasons recognized as a gift. On the 6th day, Dale Cruz came into the cookhouse in the middle of afternoon prep. He was alone, again, and he looked at what was on the stove with an expression that had somewhere along the way lost most of its contempt. "We're short on supplies," he said. "Everybody knows it." "I know," Hazel said. "But the food hasn't been bad." She looked at him. "Is that a compliment, Mr. Cruz?" He looked uncomfortable. "It's an observation." "I'll take it," she said, and turned back to the stove. He stood there another moment, like he had more to say and wasn't sure yet what it was. Then he left. She listened to his boots on the frozen ground going back toward the barn, and she felt something loosen slightly in her chest. Not victory, because it wasn't that, and not relief exactly either. Just the particular feeling of having been inside a long, cold silence and hearing it begin, very slowly, to thaw. Logan was at the end of the table for supper that night. He didn't look at her differently. But when the meal was done and the men were pushing back from the table, he paused when he passed her on the way to the door. "You're doing good work," he said, low enough that only she could hear it. And then he was gone. She stood in the middle of the cookhouse with a stack of plates in her hands and listened to the door close. And she thought about those 4 words. Not because they were surprising, and not because she needed them, but because they were the first words anyone in this place had said to her that didn't come with a calculation behind them. No contempt, no grudging acknowledgement, no management of her expectations. Just a fact, stated plainly, by a person who had been watching long enough to know. She put the plates in the basin and started the water for washing and told herself it didn't mean anything, which was already a sign that it meant something. The night deepened outside and the temperature dropped further, And somewhere out in the dark, the wind that never fully stopped in January at Iron Ridge Ranch picked up again, pushing against the walls of the cookhouse like it was testing them, looking for the weak spots. Hazel banked the fire, wiped down the range, checked the stores one more time by the light of the lamp, and wrote in her small notebook the plan for tomorrow's breakfast. She was 30 miles from the nearest town, surrounded by men who had started the month thinking she was a joke, in a kitchen that wasn't hers yet, but was becoming hers meal by meal, day by day, one morning, fire at a time. She pulled her coat tighter and went to bed. In the bunk she'd been given, a small storage room off the back of the cookhouse, which was private, which was more than she'd had in some places. She lay in the dark and listened to the wind and thought about the road that had brought her here. The years in Butte. The kitchen she didn't let herself think about directly, only sideways, the way you think about a wound that's closed but not forgotten. The moment 6 months ago when she'd understood that staying in a place because it was familiar was its own kind of trap, and she'd packed the canvas bag and taken the cookbook off the shelf and walked out. She was here now. This particular cold in this particular room in this particular darkness at the end of this particular day. It was enough, she told herself. It was going to have to be enough. Outside, the wind pushed against the cookhouse walls again, and this time they held. The resupply wagon came on the 8th day, which was 2 days later than Clint had hoped, and exactly when Hazel had calculated it would arrive based on nothing more than her reading of the weather and the particular way men who make promises about delivery schedules tend to operate in winter. She was at the range when she heard the wheels on the frozen ground, and she didn't go out to watch them unload because she was in the middle of something, and the middle of something is not a good time to stop, regardless of what's happening outside. Tuck came in to tell her anyway, like she might not have heard. "Wagon's here," he said. "I know," she said. "You want to come check the order?" She handed him a list she'd written that morning. "Tell them this is what I need unloaded first. The flour and the salt pork before anything else. If they've shorted the dried beans again, write it down and bring the paper to me." Tuck looked at the list, then at her, then back at the list. He was 23 years old and had the particular expression of a young man who has recently revised his opinion of someone and hasn't quite finished processing it. He took the list and left. The beans were shorted. She wrote it in her notebook and set it aside and kept cooking. That was the rhythm of the weeks that followed. Not easy, not smooth, but functional in the way that a well-used tool is functional, worn in the right places, reliable because it has been tested. The men ate. The men worked. The food was on the table when it was supposed to be on the table, and it tasted like someone had given it real thought, and that slowly and without ceremony changed the air inside the cookhouse. Not dramatically. Nothing at Iron Ridge Ranch happened dramatically if Clint Barrow had anything to say about it. But the quality of the silence at meals shifted from the silence of people tolerating something to the silence of people actually eating, which is a different silence entirely, and Hazel could tell the difference. Dale Cruz stopped scraping his plate after the 3rd week. She noticed. She didn't mention it. What she did notice, and couldn't as easily set aside, was Logan Mercer. He had a quality she didn't have a clean word for, a kind of consistent attention that wasn't intrusive but wasn't absent either. He didn't watch her the way some of the men did, with that evaluating look that was about deciding something. He watched the way a person watches something they're still trying to understand, and he kept doing the small things. The broken handle on the gravy pot was replaced one morning when she came in before dawn, not by something new, but by a handle from another pot she'd noticed had been sitting unused on the hook, the same threading, fitted properly. She hadn't asked anyone. There was no note. The pot was just there on the table with the new handle on it, and she stood in the half-dark of the cookhouse holding her lamp and looking at it and felt something she didn't want to examine too closely. She started leaving the coffee on a little longer in the mornings. Not for any particular reason she would have admitted to. The trouble when it came from an angle she hadn't thought to guard against. It was a Tuesday in late February, which she only remembered later because she'd been planning the week's meals and had written Tuesday at the top of the page. She was in the middle of the prep for supper, a beef stew, because Clint had finally managed to get a quarter of a steer from a neighboring spread, and she'd been planning what to do with it since it arrived, when she heard raised voices in the yard. This was not unusual. Men who work outside in cold weather and close quarters raise their voices with some regularity, and she had learned which arguments were about something and which were just the weather looking for an exit. This one had a different quality. She didn't go to the door. She went to the window, which was small and fogged with steam from the pot, and she wiped a patch clear with her sleeve. It was Dale Cruz and a man she'd seen around the ranch but hadn't learned the name of yet. She thought she'd heard someone call him Reston, or maybe Weston, one of those. He was new, newer than her, arrived about 2 weeks back to cover for a hand who'd broken his ankle. He had a narrow face and a way of talking that used more words than the thought required, which she'd noticed without particularly caring about it. She couldn't hear what they were saying, but she could see Reston, she'd decided it was Reston, gesturing in the direction of the cookhouse, and she could see Dale Cruz's face, which was doing something complicated. He wasn't laughing, he wasn't agreeing exactly. He was listening with an expression she didn't quite have a name for, somewhere between interested and uncomfortable. She went back to the stew. She knew something had changed at supper. Not because of the food. The stew was the best thing she'd put on that table, and she knew it, and the men knew it too because they went quiet in that particular way when it hit the table. But there was a different current in the room. A few sets of eyes moved to her and away again too quickly. Reston sat at the near end of the table and ate his food without looking at her at all, which was somehow worse than looking. Garrett leaned over and said something to Tuck that she didn't catch. Tuck looked up at her once and then looked back at his bowl. Logan Mercer ate his stew and did not look at her differently than he had before, which she found herself using like a handhold. After supper, when the men had cleared out, she was washing the pot when Dale Cruz came back in alone. This was unusual enough that she turned from the basin. He stood just inside the door with his hat in his hands, which was another unusual thing because Dale Cruz was not a man who stood with his hat in his hands. He was a man who stood with his hat on his head, taking up space, deciding things. The hat in the hands was new. "There's going to be talk," he said. She waited. "Reston." He said the name like he was tasting something bad. "He was through Butte last year, said he knows where you worked before." He stopped. He looked at the hat. Said it wasn't just a kitchen. Hazel set down the pot she was holding, slowly, and turned to face him fully. The water dripped from her hands onto the floor. "What did he say exactly?" Dale looked up at her. For the first time since she'd arrived, he looked actually uncomfortable in a way that had nothing to do with managing her. "Said you worked at Mabel Driscoll's place, on Elm Cross Street." The silence in the cookhouse was complete except for the pop of the firebox and the water still dripping from her fingers. Mabel Driscoll's place on Elm Cross Street in Butte, Montana, was a lot of things. It was a boarding house and a drinking establishment, and depending on who you asked and how specific they were willing to be, other things besides. It was also the place where Hazel Brooks had worked for 11 months as the kitchen cook, making 3 meals a day for 16 women who lived in that building and had not chosen all of their circumstances, getting paid in cash and keeping her head down and making the best food she could manage on Mabel Driscoll's budget, which was tight in ways that had nothing to do with the money the establishment actually brought in. She had not been one of Mabel Driscoll's women in the way Reston was clearly implying. She had been the cook. She had been 22 years old and broke, and it was the only job anyone would give her, and she had taken it because not eating was worse than the alternative, and she had left when she had enough saved to leave, and she had not looked back. None of that would matter. She knew it before Dale Cruz finished his sentence. "It'll be around by morning," Dale said. "I thought you should know. I didn't—" He stopped, started again. "I wasn't the one who spread it." "I know," she said. "For what it's worth." "It's worth something," she said, which was true. And she meant it to be a dismissal, and he took it as one and left. She stood in the empty cookhouse for a while after that, not moving. The stew pot was still half full, and she should strain it and store it, and she would, in a minute. She looked at the cookbook on the shelf. Her mother's cookbook, the one that had come across 4 states with her, the one whose spine she'd repaired twice with strips of leather because she could not afford to lose it. The cover was stained and the pages were soft with use, and some of the ink had faded to the point where she knew certain recipes from memory now, not from reading. She looked at it like a person looks at the one thing in a room they are certain of. Then she turned back to the pot and finished the washing up. The morning confirmed it. She felt the change in the room the way you feel a drop in temperature. Not all at once, but in accumulating small details. Tuck arrived to breakfast and didn't meet her eyes. Garrett sat at the far end of the table, which he hadn't done in a month. 3 other men she'd built a functional quiet with over the previous weeks arrived, ate, and left without the particular small things, the nod, the brief thanks, the second cup requested directly, that had become the texture of her mornings. It wasn't a wall exactly. It was more like a withdrawal. People putting distance between themselves and something they'd been told was contaminated. Reston arrived last. He sat down, put his plate in front of him, and looked at her directly for the first time since the previous night. He had a small, particular smile that wasn't really a smile. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she said, and turned back to the range. She cooked. The biscuits were right. The eggs were right. The coffee was strong, and she had the molasses on the table because she always had the molasses on the table. She moved through the morning the way she always moved through the morning, which is to say with full attention on what needed attention, because the work was the work and it did not change because people's opinions had. But it cost her something. She was honest enough with herself to know that. Logan came in mid-morning. He came in the way he sometimes came in, not for food, but to fix something. There was always something in the cookhouse that wanted fixing, and he had a habit of finding it on his own time without making a production of it. This morning, it was the latch on the back door, which had been stiff for 2 weeks, and finally refused to cooperate that morning when she'd gone out to get wood. He worked on it quietly while she started the prep for the midday meal. They didn't talk for a long time. She found that she didn't mind. His silence was a different kind than the silence she'd woken up to that morning. The morning silence had been exclusion. This was just two people in the same space, each doing their work. "You heard," she said. It wasn't a question. He didn't pause on the latch. "Yes." "Reston." "Yes." She was quiet for another moment. "What do you think?" He set down the tool he was using and turned to look at her. He had a direct way of looking that she had noticed in the first days. Not hard, just level, like he'd decided that looking at things straight was simpler than the alternative. "I think Reston is the kind of man who finds out something about someone and uses it like a weapon because having a weapon feels better to him than not having one." She looked at him. "That's not what I asked." He picked the tool back up. "I know what you did there. You cooked." "How do you know that?" "Because you cook the way a person cooks when that's all they've ever done, not like someone who was doing something else and cooked on the side. It's in how you move." He worked the latch, tested it, worked it again. "And because Mabel Driscoll's kitchen had a reputation, people who knew Butte knew about it, said the food was the best in that part of town, said whoever was back there knew what they were doing." She stared at him. "You knew." "I didn't know it was you. I know it now." The latch gave, cleanly, and he opened and closed the door twice to test it. "It doesn't change what I know about you." She turned back to the cutting board and started on the onions, and if her eyes were wet, she let herself believe it was the onions, and he let her believe it too. By midday, it was past the point of whispers and into the open air of the bunkhouse, in the way that things become public on a ranch. Not through one conversation, but through 100 small ones, and suddenly everyone has a position on something no one had to vote on. Hazel set out the midday meal, and the room had a new arrangement to it, subtle but real. There was a gap near the middle of the table, not huge, but enough that she noticed. It was the gap of people deciding they didn't want to be associated with something. She had sat on the other side of that gap once or twice in her life, which meant she understood exactly what it felt like to be the thing people were moving away from. She stood her ground at the range and served the meal, and did not look at the gap and did not acknowledge it. And when Reston came to the table and looked at her with that same small, almost smile, she looked back at him, flat and even, until he looked away first. The afternoon was long. She had the evening meal to plan, and a pantry to inventory, and a stove that needed cleaning, and she did all of it, one after the other, and she did not think about what was happening in the yard or the bunkhouse, because thinking about it would not change it, and she had things that needed doing. Clint came in at 4. He didn't sit. He stood in the doorway in his coat, which meant he wasn't staying. "I've heard the talk," he said. "I assumed you would. Anything you want to tell me?" She met his eyes. "I worked in the kitchen at Mabel Driscoll's place in Butte for 11 months. I cooked. That was all I did. I left when I had enough saved to go. I took no other work that wasn't in a kitchen." She paused. "That's all there is." Clint held her gaze for a long moment. He was a man who'd seen a lot of different kinds of people and developed, she thought, a fairly calibrated eye for when something was straight and when it wasn't. He looked at her, and whatever he was measuring came up the way he expected it to, because he nodded. "All right," he said. "That's it? What else do you want me to say?" She thought about it. "Nothing, I suppose." "You've got a job," he said. "Do it." And he left. She stood there holding a wooden spoon and felt something that wasn't quite gratitude and wasn't quite relief, but lived in the same neighborhood. Clint Barrow was not a warm man, and he was not going to defend her publicly, and she didn't expect him to. But he had looked at her and taken her word for what she'd said, and in the particular economy of this place and this situation, that was not nothing. The evening meal went the way the morning had. Functional, cold underneath, the gap still there. Reston eating with his shoulders relaxed like a man who has thrown a stone and is watching it roll. Dale Cruz eating with his eyes mostly on his plate, which she couldn't interpret and didn't try. Logan at the end of the table, eating his food, saying nothing, not looking at her with the eyes of someone managing her, but simply there the way he was always simply there. After the men left, she was alone in the cookhouse again, the way she was alone every night, and she sat on the stool by the range that she'd pushed into service as a resting place in the 30-second breaks she took between tasks, and she sat there with her hands in her lap and let herself feel it. It was the feeling of having built something over a month of careful, difficult work and watching the ground under it shift. Not collapse. She was honest about that too. The food was still good. Clint had kept her on. Logan had said what he'd said. The structure held. But something had changed in the room where she worked every day, and it would not change back quickly, if it changed back at all. And the effort of moving through it every morning was going to be a weight she hadn't been carrying before and was carrying now. She was used to weight. That didn't make it lighter. She took her mother's cookbook off the shelf and opened it to no page in particular, just the middle, where the pages fell open because they'd been held open the most in that section. Her mother's handwriting was in the margins. Small notes, adjustments, the kind of annotations a cook makes when a recipe is a starting point and not a destination. Hazel had her mother's hands. She'd been told that by 3 different people who'd known her mother, and she believed it because when she looked at her own hands, flour-dusted, work-rough, knuckles a little swollen from the cold, she thought she could see it. Her mother had made food for people who didn't always deserve it. She had made food for a husband who complained about it, and for neighbors who came to borrow and didn't return, and for anyone who showed up at the door during the hard years because that was simply what you did with food if you had it and other people didn't. She had not made the food because the people deserved it. She had made it because that was what the work was, and the work was not contingent on the people. Hazel set the cookbook back on the shelf. She would make breakfast in the morning. She would make it well. If the room was cold, the food would still be hot, and that was her answer to whatever Reston had put in the air. Not a speech, not a confrontation. The food, every day, at the standard she set for herself, and not the standard anyone else had set for her. The next 3 days were versions of the same. Not worse, not better. The gap at the table stayed where it was. Reston had settled into a comfortable middle distance from her, not aggressive enough to force any issue, present enough to keep the temperature low. She noticed 2 of the men who had previously been in the habit of bringing their plates to the range for second helpings were now waiting, or not asking at all. She noticed and did not comment. What she noticed less, because she was not watching for it and it was not loud enough to catch her attention immediately, was that Logan had started arriving to the cookhouse earlier. Not so early that it was obvious, not early enough to require explanation, just a quarter hour ahead of when the other men arrived, sitting at the end of the table with his coffee in both hands, quiet. He didn't initiate conversation. He didn't hover. I was just there, the way a solid thing is there, reliable in its mass and its stillness, and she understood after a few mornings that it was a choice he'd made, to occupy that particular space in that particular window, and she didn't ask him about it, and he didn't explain it. It was on the 4th morning after Reston's news had spread that she came in before 4 and found the firebox not cold, but low. Someone had banked it late, later than she usually did, which meant the kitchen was warmer than usual at that hour. She stood in the middle of the cookhouse and looked at the range and then at the small pile of fresh wood stacked beside it, neatly, the way wood is stacked when someone is thinking about the person who will use it and not just getting it off the ground. She did not know for certain, but she thought she knew. And she stood there in the pre-dawn dark of a Montana February with her coat still on and felt something move in her chest that she didn't have precise language for. Something that was not quite hope, because hope implied uncertainty about the future, and this was more immediate than that. It was something more like recognition. The recognition of being seen, not as a problem to be managed or a rumor to be evaluated or a body to be categorized, but just seen, the way you see a person who is doing their work in difficult conditions, and you understand, without needing it explained, what that costs. She took her coat off and hung it on the hook and started the coffee. 2 days later, Reston made his next move, and she hadn't predicted the form it would take. She'd been braced for another conversation, another whisper, another arrangement of bodies at the table. She hadn't been braced for him to say it to her directly. He came to the cookhouse in the middle of the afternoon, when she was alone. He leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed and looked at her with the particular confidence of a man who believes he holds something valuable and is deciding how to spend it. "You know what's funny?" he said, which was not a question. She did not turn around. "I'm working. What's funny is that you've got half these men eating out of your hand and the other half are eating your food and thinking about where you come from." He paused. "Clint keeping you on doesn't change what everybody knows." She stirred the pot. "I'm not asking you to eat my food, Mr. Reston." "No, but you're asking me to pretend I don't know what I know." He shifted against the doorframe. "And I'm a man who has a hard time pretending." "Then don't." She turned then, because turning away from him had been a choice, and so was this. She looked at him straight. "I worked in a kitchen. You say otherwise. You're lying. If you want to spend your energy here doing that, that's your time and not mine." She held his eyes. "But I'll tell you something. The men in this room eat my food every single day. And the way a person cooks tells you things about them that nothing else will. They know it even if they can't say it. And no story you put in the air is going to take that away, because it's in the food, and the food is in them." She turned back to the range. "Now I'm going to ask you to leave, because I'm working." A long pause. Then his boots on the floor going back toward the door. She didn't let herself feel anything about it until she heard him gone. Then she gripped the edge of the prep table with both hands and stood there and breathed, just breathed, until her hands stopped shaking. That was when she heard a different boot step, quieter, from the direction of the back door, which she'd left open an inch because the cookhouse ran hot in the afternoon. She turned. Logan Mercer was standing there, coat on, just inside the door, and the look on his face told her he'd heard at least the last part of it. "How long have you been standing there?" she said. "Long enough." She felt something between embarrassment and anger, and then the anger won, just slightly. "I didn't need—" "I know," he said. "I handled it." "I know that too." He stepped further in and stopped, keeping his distance, and looked at her with that level, careful look of his. "I wasn't going to step in. I was just—" He paused, trying for the word and not quite finding it. "I was here." She looked at him for a moment. The shaking in her hands had stopped. "Why?" she said, and it wasn't accusatory. It was a real question, the kind she only asked when she needed the real answer. I was quiet for a beat too long. Then he said, "Because somebody should be." She turned back to the stove because she needed to, because the pot needed tending, and also because she needed to not be looking at him while she put the thing he'd just said somewhere safe. The evening came on. The meal got made. The men ate. Reston sat at the near end of the table and ate his supper without incident and did not look at her, and she did not look at him. And across the room, Dale Cruz ate his food and refilled his bowl once without ceremony, which was not a speech but was its own kind of statement. And Logan sat at the end of the table nearest the door, where the cold came in, and ate every bite she'd put on the table. That night, lying in the storage room off the back of the cookhouse, listening to the wind that never fully quit, Hazel stared at the ceiling and thought about the word Logan had used. Should. Not wanted to. Not had to. Should. Like it was a thing that was simply owed, by the general order of things, to a person doing what she was doing in the conditions she was doing it in. She turned on her side and looked at the wall and told herself that she was tired and that she had to be up before 4, and that tomorrow was another day that would require the same things from her that today had required, and that was fine, and she was prepared for it. Outside, the Montana winter moved against the walls of the cookhouse like it was looking for the part that would give, and the walls held, the same way they had been holding, and the fire she'd banked before bed threw its heat out into the dark room and kept it from going fully cold. She closed her eyes. She did not sleep right away, but eventually she did. The days after Reston's visit to the cookhouse settled into a kind of armed quiet that Hazel had learned over the years to distinguish from actual peace. It looked similar from the outside. Meals served, meals eaten, the ranch operating on its winter rhythms without visible incident. But she could feel the difference the way you feel a splinter you haven't found yet. A low-grade awareness that something is lodged in the wrong place and has not finished making itself known. Reston had backed off the direct approach. That much was clear. Whatever he'd expected from the confrontation in the cookhouse, capitulation, tears, some visible crack he could widen, he hadn't gotten it, and men like Reston recalibrate when a strategy doesn't produce the expected result. He didn't stop, exactly. He just moved sideways. A comment here, just loud enough to carry. A way of describing how he'd known someone in Butte, letting the implication do the work that the words didn't have to. He was patient about it, which made him more dangerous than if he'd simply been loud. Hazel watched this the way she watched weather coming in over the ridge. Not with fear, exactly, but with the full attention of someone who understands that conditions change, and preparation is the only honest response. The men who had drifted toward the middle of the table stayed in the middle. A few of the older hands, men who'd been at Iron Ridge for years before she arrived and had some deeper investment in the place, seemed to be waiting to see which way things settled before committing to a position. That was not hostility, but it wasn't help either. It was the particular neutrality of people who have learned that taking sides costs something and are deciding whether the cost is worth it. Dale Cruz had landed somewhere unexpected. She wouldn't have called it friendship, and she didn't think he would have either. But something in his posture toward her had shifted after the night he'd come to warn her. He was not warm, not by nature, but he was no longer performing contempt, and there was a difference between a man who has decided you're beneath notice and a man who has decided you're complicated and is waiting to see what that means. Dale Cruz had moved from the first position to the second, and she let it be what it was without pushing it. Logan remained what he had been, steady, present, quiet in a way that had weight to it. He continued arriving early. The firebox continued to be banked later than she banked it on the nights she was sure she'd been the last one in the cookhouse. She did not ask him about this, and he did not explain it, and the unspoken agreement between them to leave it unspoken was its own kind of conversation. She thought about him more than she wanted to. She was honest with herself about that, at least. The storm arrived on a Thursday, which she knew because she wrote the day at the top of her meal plan page every morning, and Thursday was what she'd written when she woke before 4 to find the temperature had dropped another 10 degrees overnight, and the wind was doing something different than its usual work against the cookhouse walls. There was a lower register to it, a sound that got into the bones of the building rather than just pressing against the surface. She'd heard that sound twice before in her life, and both times it had preceded the kind of storm that changed the shape of the landscape when it was done. She kept the range burning harder than usual and started breakfast and thought about her stores. Clint came in at 5:30, which was early for him. "Weather service out of Billings is calling it a bad one," he said, standing in the door with his coat buttoned to the top. "Could be 2 days of heavy snow and wind. We're pulling the men in early to get the horses secured and the barn sealed before it hits." "When?" "Afternoon, maybe sooner." He looked at the range. "Can you manage with what you have if we're stuck inside 3-4 days?" "Yes," she said. "I'll need to move some stores in from the outer pantry before the snow gets heavy. The walkway between here and there will be impassable if we wait." He nodded. "I'll send someone to help you move it." He sent Tuck and Garrett, which meant she had an hour with 2 young men who were still not sure where they stood on the question of her, and expressed this uncertainty by working hard and talking very little. That was fine. She told them what to move and in what order, and they moved it, and by 10 in the morning she had everything she needed inside the cookhouse and the outer pantry door sealed against the coming weather. The storm came in faster than Clint had predicted. By noon, the snow was horizontal. By 2 in the afternoon, you couldn't see the bunkhouse from the cookhouse door, which was 30 feet, and the sound outside had become a continuous roar with no gaps in it, the kind of noise that stops being background after a while and starts being a presence. She had the stew on for supper, a big pot, double the usual quantity, because she'd learned that a bad storm makes men want more food, not less. Something about the cold getting into a person and the body trying to compensate. And the range was running hot, and the cookhouse was the warmest building on the property, which it usually was. She was cutting the last of the root vegetables when she first smelled it, not the stew, something else. She stopped cutting and lifted her head and identified it. In the same moment, she identified the thin gray thread of it curling from the far corner of the ceiling near the wall that shared its other side with the wood storage lean-to. Smoke. Not cook-fire smoke. Structure smoke, which smells different, older, drier, with something chemical underneath it that regular wood smoke doesn't have. She moved to the wall and put her palm flat against it. It was hot. Not warm. Hot. She moved fast. She pulled the stew off the range and put it on the stone hearth. Then she went to the door and opened it against the wind, which hit her like a wall and nearly took the door off its hinge. She wrestled it back to halfway and screamed into the storm. Not words at first, just volume, because volume carries further than words in wind like that. Then, fire! The cookhouse! Fire! The wind took her voice and shredded it. She could not tell if anyone had heard. She went back inside because there was nothing else to do outside. And the smoke in the ceiling corner was thicker now, and she could hear it. A sound she'd heard once before in her life and hoped never to hear again. The low crackling of something that has decided to burn and is working out how to do it most efficiently. The lean-to. The wood stored against the building's outer wall, and the wind driving heat from somewhere. She didn't know from where, maybe a spark off the chimney in the gale, into the dry timber. It was the worst possible combination: dry wood, extreme wind, and a shared wall. She grabbed her coat and the cookbook from the shelf. Her hands went there without instruction, a reflex she didn't think about. And she went to the door again. This time, through the snow, she could see a figure coming across the yard at a dead run. Logan. He hit the door before she could get it fully open, and for a second they were both in the frame, the wind screaming around them, and she saw his face. Not panicked, which surprised her, but sharp and focused in a way she hadn't seen before. Every piece of his attention gathered for one purpose. "Is it inside yet?" he said. "The ceiling in the back corner. The wall's hot. It's the lean-to." "Anyone else in there?" "No, just me." "Come out." He had her arm already. Not rough, but absolute. "The stew's on the hearth. I moved it. Hazel." His voice cut through the wind and the smoke and the noise of everything. "Come out now." She came out. The cold hit her like a sentence. She stood in the yard with her coat half on and her mother's cookbook under her arm and watched Logan go back into the cookhouse. She did not understand this immediately. She stood in the blowing snow and watched the door he'd gone through and felt the cold and heard the fire. From out here she could hear it better, a lower and more serious sound than it had been from inside, and thought, what is he doing? Clint appeared out of the white beside her. Then two other men she could barely see. Clint was already organizing, someone to the barn for the equipment they could salvage if the fire spread, someone else to the water, though water in this wind in this cold was close to useless, and everyone knew it. "Who's in there?" Clint said. Logan went back in. Clint's face did something she'd never seen it do before. "For what?" "I don't know." They found out 3 minutes later when Logan came back through the door with his coat over his arm and something in his hands. Two things. Her small notebook, the one she kept the meal plans in, that she'd left on the prep table, and the cast iron ladle that had been her mother's, the one she'd brought from home and kept on a separate hook from the ranch's equipment because she didn't want it lost in Clint's inventory. She had not asked anyone to get these things. She hadn't told anyone about the ladle. She hadn't known she'd left the notebook until she saw it in his hands. He was coughing when he came out. His coat, she saw, had a scorched patch on the left shoulder. That was... She stopped. She looked at the scorched patch and then at his face, which was wind-reddened and had smoke in it around the eyes. "You didn't have to go back in there." He held the notebook and the ladle out to her. "You moved the stew," he said, like that answered it. She took them and looked at him and felt something that was too big for the moment to properly contain, something that had been building in the weeks since she'd arrived and chose now, in the middle of a Montana blizzard, with the cookhouse burning behind them, to make itself fully known. She swallowed it down because there was too much happening and no space for it, and that was the honest truth. The fire took the lean-to and the back corner of the cookhouse before Clint's men got enough snow packed against the wall to stop its progress. The range survived. The ceiling in the corner would need new timber. The structure, mostly, held. In the accounting of disasters, it was a middling one, bad enough to cause real damage, not bad enough to destroy everything. The stew on the hearth was cold but undamaged, and she reheated it that evening on the bunkhouse stove, crowded into a space not meant for a full kitchen operation, feeding 16 men from a single pot in a room full of boot-damp wool and coal smoke, and they ate every bit of it. Logan sat near the door, same as always, as if the whole geography of the place had simply shifted around him, and ate his stew and said nothing. His left hand, she noticed from across the room, had a red patch on the back of it. A burn. Not serious from the look of it, but real. He hadn't mentioned it. She doubted he would. She brought him the cloth she'd wet in cold water, wordlessly, and set it on the table beside his bowl. He looked at it, then at her, then he picked it up and laid it across the back of his hand. "Thank you," he said. "Same to you," she said. After the meal, when the men had settled into the bunkhouse routines, card games, quiet talk, the particular relaxed energy of people who have survived an interesting afternoon and are now warm and fed. Hazel sat on a crate near the bunkhouse stove with her notebook open on her knee and tried to think about tomorrow's breakfast. She got 3 words into the page and stopped. Logan was sitting on the bench along the far wall, alone, not in the card game. His hand was still wrapped in the cloth, which had dried out. He was looking at the floor with the particular expression of a man sorting through something internal and not finding it in the order he expected. She crossed the room and sat on the far end of the same bench. Not close, just in the same general address. "What were you thinking?" she said. "Going back in." He looked up. "That there were things you'd want. Things aren't worth a person." "You'd already come out," he said. "The risk was manageable. The roof could have, but it didn't." She looked at his hand. "That isn't nothing." "No," he said. "It's not nothing." He turned his hand over, looked at the red patch himself, turned it back. "I've had worse." They sat in the noise of the bunkhouse, cards slapping the table, someone laughing at something, the stove ticking, and she thought about what to say next and came up short, which was unusual for her. She was not a woman who frequently ran out of language, but sitting on that bench with the sound of the fire she'd just survived still in her ears, and Logan Mercer a few feet away with a burn on his hand, she found that the words she had available were not equal to what was happening. He spoke first, and what he said was not what she expected. "I saw you before," he said, "before Iron Ridge." She turned to look at him. "What?" "In Butte." He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at his hands. "Not at Mabel Driscoll's. Before that. You were in the market on 2nd Street. There was a man, I don't know who he was, a merchant or something. He'd sold you something, and when you got outside you looked at it and realized it wasn't what you'd asked for. Wrong weight or wrong kind, I don't remember exactly. And you went back in to tell him." Hazel stared at him. The memory surfaced. Yes, a market, a vendor who'd substituted cheaper flour for the bread flour she'd ordered, and she'd caught it at the door and gone back. "And he didn't take it well," Logan continued. "He started saying things, loud things, about your weight, about how a woman who should be eating less shouldn't be so particular about her flour." He paused. "There were people standing around, a fair number." She said nothing. She remembered the people standing around. "And you—" He stopped again, the same way he stopped when the word he needed wasn't in the right place. "You didn't cry. You didn't shout back. You just stood there and looked at him until he was done. And then you said, 'I couldn't hear it from where I was, but I could see your face.' And then you put the package on the counter and walked out. I told him his scale was off by a quarter pound across 3 different items, and that whoever was checking his weight should be fired," Hazel said, from somewhere very far back. "And then I walked out." Logan looked at her then. "I didn't say anything. I was standing in the doorway when it started, and I had a full second where I could have stepped in, and He shook his head, a small, tight movement. "I didn't. I told myself it wasn't my business. And then you walked out and I watched you go, and I knew that wasn't the right answer." "That was 2 years ago," she said. "Yes." "You didn't know me." "No." "So why—" She stopped. "Because I saw your face when he was talking," Logan said. "And I knew what it cost you to stand there and not come apart. And I did nothing. And I have thought about that more times than I can count since." He looked back at his hands. "Coming here, finding you here of all places. I don't have a word for what that was. But I thought, this time, if there was a this time." Hazel sat with this. Outside, the storm was still moving across the ranch, still throwing its weight against walls and testing corners, still filling in everything that held, still long enough to be filled. The bunkhouse was warm and crowded and smelled of men and wet wool and coal, and it was about as far from a private conversation as a room could be. "You still didn't say anything," she said, when Reston started. "No." He didn't flinch from it. "I'm not going to tell you I handled that well. I was working out—" He paused. "I was trying to figure out what you needed versus what I wanted to do. And those two things were not the same, and I got it wrong more times than I got it right." "What did you want to do?" The corner of his jaw moved, put Reston on the ground. "And what did I need?" "To not be managed by anyone, including me." She looked at him for a long time. The fire in the stove threw light and shadow across his face, and he sat there with it, not performing anything, just a man on a bench with a burn on his hand and something he'd been carrying a long time finally set down. "There's something else," he said. His voice had changed register, not much, but enough that she caught it. "The ranch," he said. "Iron Ridge." She waited. "Clint doesn't own it." He set it to the floor. "Clint manages it." A pause that held its shape. "Who owns it?" she said, though some part of her, the part that had been watching him for 2 months with more attention than she'd admitted, had already formed the shape of the answer. Logan looked at her. "My father built it. He died 4 years ago." Another pause, the kind that is filling in behind it. "I inherited it." The bunkhouse went on around them, cards, voices, the stove, and Hazel sat on the bench and felt the information settle through her in layers, each layer changing the shape of the one below it. The man who fixed the broken pot handle, the man who banked the firebox late, the man who sat at the end of the table nearest the cold door and asked for nothing and made himself easy to overlook in a room full of loud men, the man who owned every inch of the ground they were all standing on. "Why?" she said. It was not a small question. "Because I needed to know if I could work," he said. "My father ran this ranch from a distance and it suffered for it. He made decisions about men he didn't know. I didn't want to be that kind of man. He looked at his hands again. "And because I was 27 when he died, and I didn't know anything about running a cattle operation, and I needed to learn it from the ground up, and I couldn't learn it from behind a desk." "Does Clint know?" "Clint has always known. Clint was my father's man before he was mine." He exhaled slowly. "Nobody else here knows. I'd like to keep it that way for now." "Why are you telling me?" The question landed between them and stayed there. "Because I almost didn't come back out of that building," he said. "And if I hadn't, you would have known everything about me except the thing that would have changed how you see every other thing." He looked at her directly. And that didn't seem right. Hazel sat with that. She was aware of her own breathing, of the cookbook in her lap, of the burn on his hand, of the 30 feet of scorched wall in the cookhouse they'd both just walked away from. She was aware of how many versions of this moment she could respond to. The practical version, the guarded version, the version where she acknowledged it and moved sideways. The way she'd moved sideways from difficult things her whole life, because moving sideways was survivable and standing still sometimes wasn't. She sat still. "I don't know what to do with that," she said, which was the honest answer. "You don't have to do anything with it tonight," he said. "No," she said. "I don't." They sat there another few minutes in the noise of the bunkhouse, not talking, not moving away from each other either. The stove ticked. Someone won a hand of cards and made a noise about it. The wind outside went on doing what the wind does in a Montana winter, which is everything it wants and nothing you ask. Hazel opened her notebook and looked at the page she'd written 3 words on before she'd stopped. Breakfast, she thought. Tomorrow was still coming, storm or no storm, revelation or no revelation. She would need biscuits in the morning, and if the cookhouse range was workable, she'd move back in there early and get it going, and if it wasn't, she'd manage on the bunkhouse stove, cramped and inconvenient as that was, because managing was what she did. She wrote down what she needed and closed the notebook and held it in both hands. Across the room, Logan Mercer wrapped the dry cloth back around his burned hand and did not look at her again that night, which she understood was its own kind of care, giving her the space of the same room without the pressure of his attention in it. He was, she thought, a more careful man than he appeared. Or maybe he was exactly as careful as he appeared, and she just hadn't known what she was seeing. She thought about the market in Butte, the vendor with the wrong flour, the people standing around, the particular cost of standing in the middle of a public humiliation and choosing not to come apart, which she had done because she had no other choice, but which had looked, apparently, from a doorway across the room, like something else, like something worth watching, like strength. She had not felt strong that day. She had felt very alone and very tired, and the flower situation had been the fourth bad thing to happen that week, and she was at the limit of what she could absorb without something showing on her face. She had stood there and taken it because the only alternative was to give him the satisfaction of watching her break, and she was not going to give him that, and it had nothing to do with bravery and everything to do with stubbornness, which is not the same thing at all, though people sometimes mistake one for the other. Logan had seen it as something worth protecting, worth showing up for, 2 years later, in a different state, in the middle of a winter that had done its level best to break everything it touched. She didn't know what that meant yet. She was honest about that too. What she knew was that the cookhouse had a scorched wall and a ceiling that needed timber, and tomorrow she was going to be cooking in a damaged building in an ongoing blizzard for 16 men who still had mixed feelings about her. And there was a man on the bench across the room who had gone back into a burning building for her notebook and her mother's ladle and had a burn on his hand to show for it, and she was the heir to nothing except a cookbook and a skill, and the particular stubbornness that had carried her this far. That was what she had. She had always made do with what she had. The storm blew itself out sometime in the deep hours before morning. She heard the change in it, the way the roar dropped to a complaint and then to a mutter, through the thin wall of whatever sleep she'd managed on the bunk Clint had arranged for her in the corner of the storage room off the bunkhouse. She lay in the dark and listened to the quiet coming back, piece by piece, until it was mostly quiet outside and mostly not inside her. She got up before 4. The cookhouse range had survived. The corner of the ceiling was open to the gray before dawn sky through the scorched gap in the wood, which meant cold coming in from above. But the range itself was intact and the firebox was cold, and she was used to a cold firebox. She built the fire the way she always built it, from the bottom, from the smallest possible beginning, feeding it carefully until it caught and held, and she could feel the warmth begin to work its way out from the iron. She stood with her hands near the surface of the range and looked at the hole in the ceiling where the stars were fading out, and the first gray was starting, and she thought about last night, and she thought about Butte, and she thought about what Logan had said, and the way he'd said it, and she thought about the fact that he owned this ranch and had been working it in silence and hadn't told her until a building was on fire, and he'd decided that not telling her was a kind of lie he wasn't willing to keep carrying. The coffee water went on. She made biscuits by the light of the lamp, the ceiling above her open to the sky, the cold coming in from that gap and the warmth coming up from the range, and the two of them met somewhere in the middle, and she worked in the imperfect temperature between them, and the biscuits came out exactly as they always came out, which was right. The first man through the door was Logan, same as most mornings now. Earlier than the others, coat on, moving carefully because his hand was still bandaged with the cloth she'd given him the night before. He stopped when he saw the ceiling, looked at it for a moment. "I can get timber," he said. "It can wait till after breakfast," she said. He nodded and went to his place at the table. She poured his coffee. He wrapped both hands around the cup, the burned one and the other, and sat with it, and the cookhouse smelled of coffee and biscuits and cold air coming through the open ceiling, and somewhere outside the last of the storm was letting go of the ridge and moving on. The timber for the ceiling came from the barn supply, and Logan brought it himself 2 days after the storm, carrying the lengths across the yard in the gray morning light with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything. He didn't ask for help, and nobody offered any, which was the way things worked at Iron Ridge. A man did his work, and other men noticed it or didn't, and the work got done either way. Hazel watched him from the cookhouse doorway for a moment before she went back to the range. She had a habit now of clocking where he was when he was on the property, which she recognized as a new habit, and did not particularly like recognizing. The ceiling repair took him most of that day and part of the next. He worked on it in the hours between his ranch duties, early morning and late afternoon, and by the second evening the gap was closed and the cold from above had stopped, and the cookhouse felt like itself again, which was warmer than it had been in the 3 days since the fire. She came in the next morning and stood in the middle of the room and put her hand up toward the repaired section and felt no draft, and something in her chest that had been slightly clenched since the fire unclenched itself 1 degree. She knocked on the doorframe of the supply room where Logan was sorting rope that afternoon. "The ceiling's good," she said. He looked up. I saw a gap on the left side, but I packed it. I don't feel it. All right. He went back to the rope. She stood there another second. Thank you for that and for, She stopped. You said thank you already, he said. The night of the fire. I know. I'm saying it again. He looked at her then. That level look that she had come, over these weeks, to understand as his version of openness. Not demonstrative, but fully present in a way that a lot of louder people weren't. You don't have to keep accounting for things, he said. Neither do I. She nodded and left, and the conversation sat in her for the rest of the day with the particular weight of something that had been said precisely right. What she was not prepared for, had not let herself think carefully about, because thinking carefully about a thing sometimes makes it more real than you're ready for, was what Logan's revelation meant in the hours and days after the fire, once the immediate crisis had passed and the ordinary machinery of ranch life had started back up. The timber was repaired. The stew pot was back on the range. The men ate breakfast, dinner, and supper. Reston was still at the table, still eating food he didn't deserve, still carrying his small smile like something he'd picked up and couldn't put down. All of this was the same. But something had shifted in the walls of the thing, in the structure beneath the surface, and she could feel it even when she couldn't see it. Logan owned Iron Ridge. Logan had been working beside these men for 3 years as one of them, while holding a fact about himself that changed everything about the situation, and he'd made that choice deliberately, for reasons that she understood intellectually. She had even, on first hearing, found them reasonable, but which had a different quality now that the initial shock had worn off. What she was left with, in the quiet morning hours before anyone else was up, was a question she kept approaching from different angles without quite being able to settle it. What did it mean that the most powerful person on this property had watched Reston poison the water around her and said nothing? What did it mean that he'd fixed her pot handle and banked her fire in secret while he could have simply, as the man whose name was on the deed, told Reston to collect his pay and get off the land? She didn't think his reasons were cynical. She didn't think he'd done any of it from calculation. But the distance between what he could have done and what he had done was real, and she was not the kind of woman who pretended distances weren't there, just because the terrain was otherwise pleasant. She turned this over while she made bread on the Friday morning after the storm. Bread required attention but not thought, or rather, the hands could work while the mind went elsewhere. And she let her mind go there while she worked the dough, pushing it forward and folding it back, the familiar resistance of it, the way it changed under sustained pressure. Her mother had said once that bread dough told you when it was ready, and that the telling was in the feel rather than the time, and that most people who had trouble with bread were people who were watching the clock instead of their hands. Hazel had thought about that observation in context beyond bread many times since. The dough was ready when it was ready. Logan came in at his usual early hour, and she didn't say anything about what she'd been thinking, and he didn't push for conversation, and they occupied the cookhouse in the particular companionable quiet that had become, without either of them arranging it, one of the fixed textures of her mornings. She thought, this is the thing I would miss. Not the money, not the security of the position, not even the kitchen, though the kitchen was the most functional she'd had in years. She would miss this particular silence at this particular hour with this particular person in it. That thought was what told her she was in trouble. She was not a woman who had let herself want things that depended on other people's decisions. She had learned that lesson in increments across the years, and it had been an expensive education, and she had come out the other side of it with a clear understanding of what was hers to control and what wasn't. What was hers? The work, the food, the standard she set for herself and held herself to regardless of what the room around her was doing. What wasn't hers? Anything that required another person to stay. Logan Mercer was not hers to count on. I was not hers in any way she had a right to claim, and his confession in the bunkhouse, whatever warmth was in it, was also a complication she hadn't asked for and wasn't sure she knew how to carry. She put the bread in to bake and poured herself a coffee and stood at the range and thought about this clearly, without sentiment, the way she tried to think about things that mattered. By the end of that week she had come to no conclusion, which was itself a conclusion of sorts. She kept cooking. She kept the standard. She watched the dynamic in the room shift further. The fire had done something to the temperature between Hazel and the men that Reston's whispers had failed to do. There is something about a crisis survived together that reorganizes people's priorities, whether they want it to or not. Tuck and Garrett had moved back toward the center of the table. Two of the older hands who'd been maintaining careful neutrality had begun, in small ways, to drop it. A brief nod in passing, a quiet thanks after supper, the kind of acknowledgement that costs a man nothing except the willingness to make it. Reston noticed this. She could see him noticing. He made his next move on a Wednesday, and he made it with an audience, which told her he'd decided that the private approach had reached its limit. It was at supper. The room was full. All 16 men, plus Clint, who occasionally ate in the cookhouse when the paperwork ran late. And the food was on the table, and people were partway through their meal when Reston spoke. He didn't raise his voice. He said it in a conversational register, which was almost worse the way he pitched it to Carrie without seeming to try. Had a letter from my cousin in Butte, he said, to the middle of the table, to nobody and everybody. He knows a man who used to work the door at Mabel Driscoll's on Elm Cross. Said the cook there was well known in certain circles. He let the pause do its work. Real talented woman, big girl, couldn't miss her. The table went quiet in the way a table goes quiet when something is landing in it that everyone can feel. Hazel was at the range. She turned around. She did not raise her voice either. "Mr. Reston," she said, "if you have something to say to me, say it to me." He looked at her with that small, settled smile. "I'm just talking about what I heard." "You're talking about me," she said, "so talk to me." "All right." He leaned back slightly. "Did you or didn't you work at a place that wasn't just a kitchen?" The room was so quiet she could hear the firebox. "I worked in the kitchen," she said. "That was all I did there. I cooked. Every day. 3 meals. For 11 months. And I left." She looked at him steadily. "If your cousin's friend says different, your cousin's friend is a liar." "Hard to prove," Reston said. And there was something in the way he said it. Easy, comfortable. The tone of a man who knows the court of public opinion doesn't require evidence. That moved something in her from cold to hot. "Let me tell you what I can prove," she said, and her voice was level, which cost her. "I can prove that in the 6 weeks I've been at this table, the food has been better than it was before I came. I can prove that Clint kept me on through 2 weeks of supply shortage and a cookhouse fire. I can prove that every man in this room has eaten what I've put in front of him without complaint." She paused. "What can you prove, Mr. Reston? What have you done here that's worth more than what you're trying to tear down?" Dead silence. Then Dale Cruz said, from the middle of the table, without looking up from his plate, "She's got a point." It was 4 words. That was all. But Dale Cruz saying them in that room at that moment was not a small thing, and everybody knew it, including Reston. She watched him recalculate. She watched the smile go slightly wrong at the edges. Clint, at the end of the table, set his fork down. "Reston," he said. "Yeah. The roads are clear now. Mizol Dispatch is looking for outriders for the spring drive." He said it to the table, not to Reston directly. "Might be worth looking into, for a man who's restless." The implication was not subtle. Reston heard it. The room heard it. Reston picked up his fork and finished his supper without another word. Hazel turned back to the range. She gripped the edge of the prep table with both hands for a moment, out of sight, and let out a slow breath. Behind her she heard, from the end of the table nearest the door, "Pass the cornbread." It was Logan's voice. Same as always, like the thing that had just happened was finished and the meal was still going and life was continuing, which it was, and which was the right answer. She picked up the cornbread pan and brought it to the table herself. She set it in front of him. He took a piece without looking up, then said quietly, "Not for the room." "You did that well." "Didn't feel like it from inside," she said, equally quiet. "Things rarely do." She went back to the range. Reston was gone by Friday. She came in to start breakfast and he wasn't at the table, and at midday Clint mentioned briefly that Reston had taken the Missoula Dispatch job and collected his pay Thursday evening. There was no ceremony about it, no visible shift in the room. He had come, and he had done the damage he'd done, and now he was gone, and the damage remained like a waterline on a wall after the flood recedes. You can see where it reached, even when the water is gone. She thought about that in the days after. The damage didn't disappear just because Reston had. Some of the men had reassembled their opinions, and some hadn't, and she was not going to get a clean slate, and she knew it, and was not fine with it, but realistic about it. Realistic was what she had instead of fine sometimes, and she had learned to work with it, What she hadn't worked out yet was Logan. He came to her on a Sunday evening, which was unusual in itself. Sunday evenings at Iron Ridge had a different quality than the rest of the week, something looser, the men off duty in a way that made the whole property feel slightly tilted from its weekday self. She was in the cookhouse doing inventory, the things she did every Sunday to set up the coming week's plans, when she heard his knock on the open door frame and looked up. He had his hat in his hands. She noticed this immediately, the same way she'd noticed it on Dale Cruz weeks ago, and thought, this is what men do with their hands when they are about to say something they can't take back. "Do you have a minute?" he said. "I'm counting flour," she said. "But yes." He came in and stood on the other side of the prep table and looked at her across it like the table was a thing he'd chosen deliberately, something to put between them while he said what he had to say. "I want to tell you what I should have done," he said. She set down the flour tin. "All right." When Reston started, the first week, he looked at the hat in his hands, then back at her. "I could have told him to leave. I have the authority. I've always had the authority. And I told myself I didn't want to use it because—" He stopped. "I told myself a lot of things. That it would undermine you, that you didn't need rescuing, that stepping in would make it worse." "Some of that was true," she said. "Some of it was also convenient," he said, and the honesty of it, the way he said it without dressing it up, landed on her. "It was convenient to tell myself you were handling it, and that the right thing was to let you handle it, because the alternative was admitting that the reason I hadn't stepped in had less to do with what you needed and more to do with the fact that I was afraid of what it would mean. For how people saw me. For the thing I'd built here." He looked at her steadily. "That's the part I'm not proud of." She was quiet for a moment. The inventory list was in her hand and she looked down at it and didn't see it. "What are you asking me?" she said. "I'm not asking you anything," he said. "I'm telling you. Because I told you the other things. About Butte, about the ranch. And I left this part out, and leaving it out was another version of the same problem." She set the list on the table. "You're harder on yourself than the situation requires." "Maybe," he said, "but I'd rather be harder than easier on this particular thing." She looked at him across the prep table in the Sunday evening cookhouse, with the lamp burning between them, and thought about what it meant that this man, who had more power in this situation than anyone else present, who could have ended Reston's campaign in a single conversation, who could have made any number of choices that would have made the past several weeks significantly less difficult for her, had instead chosen the long, uncomfortable route of watching and helping in small private ways, and then arriving at this table to account for the gap between the two. She did not think he was perfect. She had stopped thinking anyone was perfect around the age of 15 and had not revisited that position since. But he was honest, which was rarer, and she had come to believe worth more. "I don't need an apology," she said. "I know that," he said. "I'm not apologizing. I'm explaining. There's a difference." "Yes." She picked up the flour tin. "I'm going to finish this inventory," she said. "If you want to stay while I do, that's fine." He pulled the stool from the corner, the one she used in the 30-second breaks, and sat down on the other side of the room, not at the table, not in the way, and she went back to counting. He sat there while she finished the flour and moved to the cornmeal and then to the salt pork and the dried beans, marking numbers in her notebook. And he didn't talk and she didn't either, and the cookhouse held them both in the lamp-lit evening quiet. And it was fine, actually. It was more than fine. When she finished the last column, she closed the notebook and looked at him. "The ranch," she said. "What are you going to do with it?" "Eventually." He considered the question seriously, which she appreciated. "Run it right," he said, "the way my father didn't. Pay people what they're worth. Keep the land in condition instead of working it past what it can hold." He paused. "My father believed land was for using. I think land is for working with. There's a difference in that, too." "There is," she said. "What about you?" he said. "What are you going to do, eventually?" She looked at the shelf where her mother's cookbook sat. The question had a longer answer than the evening had room for, and she knew it, and she gave him the honest short version. "I want my own kitchen," she said. "Not a ranch kitchen. Something of mine. A place where people come because they want to, not because it's the only table in 30 miles. She paused. "A cafe, maybe. Small, but mine." "In Montana?" "Somewhere in Montana, yes. I don't have the specific coordinates yet." He nodded slowly, the way he nodded when he was not just hearing something but placing it somewhere. "That's a real thing," he said, "not just a dream." "I know the difference," she said. "I know you do." He stood, put the stool back in the corner. "I'll let you close up." He was almost to the door when she said, "Logan." He stopped. "The thing you said, about being afraid of what it would mean, for how people saw you." She held his eyes when he turned. "That cost you something to say." "Yes," he said. "I know that," she said. "That's all." He nodded once and went out into the Sunday evening, and she stood in the empty cookhouse for a moment before she banked the fire and turned down the lamp. The next 2 weeks had a different texture than everything before them. Not easier, exactly. The ranch ran on its own logic regardless of what was happening between any two people on it, and the work was the work. But something between her and Logan had clarified, the way broth clarifies when you've been patient with it long enough. And she found that she was no longer spending energy trying to figure out what he was or what his consistency meant. She knew what it meant. She had the shape of it now. What she hadn't figured out was what to do with the shape. He did not push. She recognized this consciously now as a choice he was making, the not pushing. Because a man who owned Iron Ridge Ranch and could have made any number of things happen simply by saying so was clearly capable of applying pressure if he chose to. He chose not to. He showed up in the morning, early, coffee, same stool if he stayed, gone before the crowd. He fixed the things that needed fixing. He did his work with the horses and the cattle and the fence line and the 10,000 tasks that keep a working ranch from falling apart. And he did it without complaint and without the kind of performing humility that some men do when they want credit for not taking credit. He was just there, consistently and without drama, there. She understood, as March began to move towards something that might eventually become spring if Montana was in the right mood, that she had fallen into caring about him in the way you fall into deep water when you're already wet. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in a gradual accumulation of small, wet moments, until you look down and realize you've been in it for a while. This did not make her happy, exactly. It made her honest. She was sitting with the cookbook one evening, late, everyone else in the bunkhouse, when she turned to the back pages where her mother had kept notes that weren't recipes, shopping lists, addresses, names of people she'd done business with, the miscellaneous margin matter of a life being lived. Her mother's handwriting there was less careful than in the recipe sections, quicker, more personal. Hazel read through it the way she sometimes did when she needed to feel like the book was a conversation and not just an object. Near the last written page, in handwriting that was older than the rest, her mother had gone back to an old page and written in the margin, because the margin was the only space left, was a sentence she had read before, but which landed differently now. A woman who knows her own kitchen knows herself. Don't let anyone convince you that what you build is less than what someone else was born to. She read it twice. Then she closed the book. She had been at Iron Ridge Ranch for 3 months. She had come with a canvas bag and a cookbook, and the particular stubbornness that had carried her across 4 states. And she had built something here. Not just the meals, not just the working relationship with a room full of men who'd started out willing to dismiss her, but something in herself, something clarified. She knew what she could do. She had demonstrated it, daily, in conditions that were not designed for her success. She had stood in the middle of public contempt and cooked anyway, and the food had been good, and that was the record. The question now was what she was going to do with it. Logan came to her on a Saturday in late March, mid-morning, not his usual hour. He came in with his coat on and his hat on, and he stood in the middle of the cookhouse and looked at her with the particular look that had come to mean he was about to say something that mattered. She had a pie in the oven, the first she'd made since the fire, because she'd been short on the right kind of fat, and it had finally come in with the last resupply. And she was standing at the prep table, and she looked at him and waited. "I want to ask you something," he said. "And I want you to know that whatever you say, nothing here changes. Your job, your position, all of it, that's not contingent on this." She registered this as the right thing to have said. "All right." He took a breath, which was the only sign of uncertainty he showed. "I'd like to call on you, formally. Or informally, if you prefer that. Whatever is right for you. He stopped. "I would like permission to say clearly that I'm interested in your company beyond what this place gives us, and to not have it be a secret thing that neither of us names." Hazel stood at the prep table and looked at him and felt the whole weight of the previous 3 months in the room with them. The laughter in the yard the day she'd arrived, the gravy on the floor and the fixed pot handle, the molasses beans and the rest and supper and the fire and the bunkhouse bench and all the mornings, all the particular mornings with the coffee and the cold outside and the lamp and the quiet that had weight to it. She thought about her mother's handwriting in the margin of the cookbook. She thought about the cafe she wanted, the kitchen that would be hers, the life she had been building toward with the same slow stubbornness she'd brought to everything else. She thought about what it meant to let someone be part of that. "I appreciate how you said that," she said, "that nothing here changes regardless. I meant it. I know you meant it." She looked at the oven, then back at him. "I'm not going to give you a quick answer to that. I'm not asking for a quick one. What I want," she said carefully, "is to be honest with you about where I am. I care about you. I think you're a better man than you give yourself credit for, and also, in some specific ways, less good than you think you are, and I know that about you now, and I'm still here." She paused. "But I have a life I'm building, and what I need to know, what I need to be sure of before I let anything change, is that the life I'm building is mine, not something that gets folded into yours." "It's yours," he said, immediately, like the answer was already there. "That's easy to say," she said. "It's harder to mean it when it actually costs something." He held her gaze. "Yes," he said. "It is. And I know I haven't proven that yet." "No," she said. "You haven't." He nodded. He looked at the floor for a moment, then back at her. "Then tell me what proving it looks like." She thought about that. "Time," she said, "and honesty. And when the two things, what's good for you and what's good for me, don't align, you tell me that instead of managing it." "I can do that." "I know you can do it," she said. "I need to know if you will." The pie was doing something in the oven. The smell of it had changed, the particular shift from baking to done, and she turned and opened the oven and checked it. And it was right, golden across the top and the edge just setting, and she pulled it out and set it on the cooling rack and looked at it for a moment the way she always looked at a thing she'd made that had come out the way it was supposed to. "I'll think about it," she said to Logan, to the pie, to the room. "That's what I can give you right now." "That's enough," he said. And he left, and she stood in the cookhouse with the smell of the pie in the air and the afternoon light coming through the window and the inventory on the table and her notebook and her mother's cookbook on the shelf. And she did what she did every time the thing in front of her was too big to hold all at once. She put it in the part of her mind that worked slowly, the part that came to conclusions the way bread dough comes to readiness, in its own time and by its own rules. And she turned back to the prep table and started on the plan for Sunday's supper. That night she wrote in the margin of the last blank page of her notebook, in her own handwriting, smaller than usual, "What you build is yours. Who you build it with is a choice. Choose like you mean it." She read it back once. Then she closed the notebook and put it on the shelf next to her mother's cookbook, where it fit exactly, as if the shelf had been waiting for it. She left Iron Ridge on a Tuesday morning in early April when the snow had pulled back far enough from the lower road to make travel possible, and the sky had that particular pale quality that comes right before Montana decides to be something other than winter for a while. She told Clint the Sunday before. She sat across from him in the ranch office with her hands in her lap and said she would be leaving at the end of the week, and she gave him enough notice to arrange for a replacement, and she offered to write out her pantry system and her weekly rotation, so whoever came next wouldn't be starting from nothing. Clint listened to all of this with his usual absence of visible emotion and then said, "I won't pretend I'm not sorry to lose you," which was the most personal thing he had ever said to her, and which she accepted as the considerable compliment it was from a man who operated in the particular economy of understatement. "You'll find someone good," she said. "Probably not as good," he said, "but functional." He paused. "Where are you going?" "Ferris Creek," she said. It was a town 40 miles east, bigger than its name suggested, on a road that saw real traffic in the warmer months. She had been thinking about it since January, building the case in her mind the way you build a case for something you already know you're going to do but need to be sure about before you say it out loud. There's a building on the main street that's been empty since the family that ran the dry goods store moved to Billings. Landlord has been advertising it since October. Clint looked at her steadily. "You've been planning this." Longer than I've been here, she said. This, she gestured, meaning the ranch, the kitchen, the whole winter. This was always a step, not a destination. He nodded, slowly. She thought he understood more than he said, which was consistent with everything she'd learned about him. I'll write you a letter, he said, for the landlord in Ferris Creek, if it helps. Something that says you ran this kitchen competently. More than competently, she said, not unkindly. Almost a smile. More than competently, he agreed. She told Logan that same evening. She had thought about how to do it, whether to find a private moment or let the news work its own way around the way news did at Iron Ridge. And she decided that after everything, a private moment was what the situation required, not out of sentimentality, but out of honesty. He had told her hard things directly. She could do the same. She found him at the fence line he'd been repairing on the east side of the property, working in the last hour of daylight. He was down on one knee resetting a post, and he looked up when he heard her coming across the frozen ground, and stood, and she could see him reading something in the way she was moving before she said anything at all. You're leaving, he said. Yes, she said. End of the week. He looked at the post in his hands and then set it down carefully against the fence line. Ferris Creek? She stared at him. How did you... You mentioned it once, back in January. You said it was the right size for what you wanted. He looked at her. I filed it. She remembered. A conversation over the coffee one early morning, almost offhand, she had mentioned the town in the context of something else entirely. She hadn't thought he was paying that particular kind of attention. Yes, she said. Ferris Creek. There's a building. He nodded. He looked at the fence line stretching away from them in the fading light, the long geometry of it, the work still in it. I have no right to ask you to stay, he said. No, she said. You don't. I'm not asking. I know you're not. She stood in the early April cold with her coat closed and looked at this man she had spent a winter learning and thought about what to say that was true and complete and didn't leave the wrong thing out. What I want you to know is that this, she paused, whatever this has been between us, it's real. I'm not leaving because it isn't real. You're leaving because the cafe is more real, he said. Not bitterly, just accurately. Yes, she said, because the cafe is mine, and I've never had a thing that was mine. He was quiet for a moment. The light was going fast the way it does in April, the sky cycling through orange to gray in the space of 20 minutes. Will you write? He said. I don't know yet, she said, and she said it because it was honest, not because she wanted to hurt him, and she thought he understood the difference. All right, he said. She went back to the cookhouse. She had supper to make, the same as every other evening, and she made it. Roast beef with the last of the winter's good root vegetables, bread, a ginger cake she'd been planning since the ginger came in with the March resupply. She put it all on the table and the men ate it with the particular enthusiasm that had become, over the course of the winter, the texture of her every meal here, and she stood at the range and watched them eat and felt something she didn't try to name because there wasn't a clean word for it, that mix of completion and grief that comes at the end of something that has been genuinely hard and genuinely worth it. Dale Cruz, on his way out, stopped beside the range. He stood there a second, hat in hand. She noticed, again, the hat, and said, Heard you're going. Yes, she said. He worked his jaw around something. Place won't eat as well, he said. No, she agreed. It won't. He put his hat on and went. She thought about the first morning, the yard, the snow, the comment he'd made that she'd walked past. She thought about the long distance between that moment and this one, and what it had taken to cover that distance, and that neither of them had traveled it smoothly or without cost. That seemed right. Smooth travel is for roads that have already been made. She had not been on a made road. On her last morning, she was up before 3, which was earlier than usual even for her. Not because there was more to do, but because she wanted the extra hour in the cookhouse, alone, before the day started. She stood in the middle of it in the lamp dark, and looked at the range and the repaired ceiling and the hooks where the pots hung and the shelf where her mother's cookbook had sat for the past 3 months beside her own notebook. And she looked at all of it the way you look at something you are deciding to remember. She cooked the best breakfast she had made all winter. Biscuits she'd started the dough for the night before and let rest, so they had the right depth to them. Eggs scrambled soft with the last of the chives she'd been keeping alive in a tin on the windowsill. Salt pork cut thick and rendered slow. A pot of oatmeal with molasses. Coffee strong enough to see through the morning by. The men came in and ate in a quiet that was different from the usual breakfast quiet. Someone had told them, or they had told each other, and the room had the particular quality of a place where something is ending and everybody knows it and nobody is sure what to do with that. Tuck ate his food without once making his usual commentary about anything. Garrett refilled his coffee and didn't speak. Even the older hands, the ones who had maintained their careful neutrality all winter, ate with a deliberateness that felt like acknowledgement. Logan was there, at the end of the table. He ate his breakfast and he looked at her once, early, and then did not look at her again. She understood this as a kindness. Some people make leave-taking harder by watching. He made it cleaner by looking away, and she was grateful for it in a way she could not have explained to anyone who hadn't also needed that particular grace. After the meal, she cleaned the cookhouse for the last time. Thoroughly, the way she cleaned it every week, every surface, and every pot in the range itself, because that was her standard, and she did not lower her standard because an audience had stopped watching. The cookbook went into the canvas bag. The notebook went on top of it. The cast iron ladle her mother had given her went in wrapped in the dishcloth she'd also been using all winter and would take because it was hers. She checked the shelf twice. Clint had arranged transport. A ranch hand making a run to a town 15 miles from Ferris Creek, close enough that she could manage the rest. He was waiting in the yard with the wagon when she came out. The morning had cleared into the kind of April day that Montana offers occasionally as a kind of apology for the winter it has just put you through. Bright and cold with a sky so blue it seemed like something someone had added deliberately. She set her bag in the wagon and turned. Half the men were in the yard. She hadn't expected that. They were not arranged formally. They were just there, some near the barn, some near the bunkhouse door, some in the open ground between, the way men gather when they don't want to make a thing of something but can't quite not show up. Dale Cruz was nearest to the wagon. He nodded at her once, a clean, short nod that said everything he was capable of saying on the subject. She nodded back. She was climbing up to the wagon seat when she heard her name. Logan's voice from behind her. She stopped and turned. He was holding something out to her, an envelope, plain, unsealed. "You don't have to read it now," he said. She took it. She looked at it in her hands. "What is it?" "Everything I should have said better," he said, "and some things I didn't say at all. And one practical thing at the end, which—" He stopped. "Just read it when you're ready." She put the envelope in her coat pocket against her chest. "Thank you," she said, "for the ceiling, and the pot handle, and the firebox." She looked at him. "And for coming back out of a burning building with my notebook." "And the ladle," he said. "And the ladle," she said. She got up on the wagon seat. The driver gave the horses the signal and they moved, and she looked forward at the road and not back at the yard, because she had learned over the years that looking back at the yard is how you make the leaving harder than it has to be, and the leaving was already hard enough. She read the letter that night in the boarding house in the town 15 miles from Ferris Creek, sitting on the edge of the bed with her coat still on because the room was cold and the fire hadn't caught properly yet. She read it twice. Then she sat with it in her lap and looked at the wall. He had written it the way he talked, plainly, without ornament, and with the particular precision of someone who has chosen every word for accuracy rather than effect. He had written about the market in Butte, again, but differently than he'd said it in the bunkhouse. More specifically, the exact thing he had felt in the doorway that day, the exact shape of his failure to act, the exact way it had stayed with him. He had written about his father's ranch and what he'd hoped to learn from working it, and what he'd actually learned, which was not always the same list. He had written about the fire, and about the notebook and the ladle, and about why those things specifically, not the stew pot, which was bigger and more practical, but the small personal things, the things that were unmistakably hers. The practical thing at the end, as he had said, was an address. A building on Ferris Creek's main street, and below it, a number. Not a large number, she thought, for a man who owned Iron Ridge Ranch, but significant for anyone else. And a sentence. "This is yours to use or not use, no conditions and no strings, because a woman who knows her own kitchen deserves the kitchen she's been building toward. This is not a claim. It's just what's right." She sat with that for a long time. She was by instinct and by history suspicious of money offered without strings. She had learned that lesson the way she had learned most of her important lessons, by having the opposite assumption proved wrong at some cost to herself. But she held the letter in the cold room and thought about the winter she had just lived through and the man she had spent it learning. And she thought about the difference between a claim and a gift. And she thought about her mother's sentence in the margin of the cookbook. And she thought about the cafe. She slept on it. Then she slept on it again. Then she went to Ferris Creek and found the building on the main street and stood in front of it for 15 minutes in the April wind and looked at it. It was not beautiful. It had been a dry goods store, and before that something else. And it had the layered history of a building that has been many things and is currently between identities. The windows were dirty. The door had warped and would need replacing. The interior, when she got the landlord to let her in, smelled of old wood and dust and something faintly chemical from whatever the previous tenants had stored. The kitchen in the back was barely a kitchen, a range that had seen better decades, a single basin, shelving that leaned. She stood in the middle of it and did what she always did. She looked at what was there and made a plan. She wrote to Logan that night. Not a long letter. She said she'd seen the building and she understood what he'd offered, and she was going to think about it for one more week before she decided. She said the building had good bones, which she believed, and that the kitchen needed significant work, which was also true. She said she would let him know. She wrote again at the end of the week. She said yes to the loan, which she was calling it specifically because she intended to pay it back, and she was writing the terms she intended herself. A percentage of monthly revenue once the cafe was operational, no timeline pressure, documented. And she was sending him a copy of her own terms along with her acceptance of his offer. And if his version of no strings meant he wouldn't accept repayment, then they had a different disagreement to work out. But she thought he understood her well enough to know she wasn't going to take a gift she hadn't earned. His response came 12 days later. It was 3 sentences. He accepted her terms. He said the document she'd written was cleaner than anything his family lawyer had drafted in the past decade. He said he hoped the kitchen had a good range. She wrote back, "The range is terrible. I'm replacing it first." The work took 6 weeks. She could not have done it alone, and she did not pretend otherwise. She hired 2 men from Ferris Creek who knew construction, and she worked alongside them every day, making decisions about the layout the way she made decisions about a menu, based on what the work actually needed, not on what looked good from the outside. The kitchen was redesigned from the single basin setup into something with real flow. Prep on the left, range in the center, 2 basins on the right, a dry goods pantry built into the back wall with proper shelving that stood level. She painted the front room herself. In the evenings after the construction crew had gone, a warm color that she chose because it was the color of the kitchen in the house she'd grown up in before everything changed. She named it Brooks' Table. Not clever, not elaborate, just accurate. It was her table, and she was Brooks, and the name said the thing it needed to say. She opened on a Wednesday in early June, which was not a traditional day for a grand opening, but was the day she was ready, and she had learned over the years that waiting for a more auspicious moment is how things that should happen don't. She made biscuits and a beef stew and a bean soup and cornbread and ginger cake. She put the menu on the board in plain handwriting. She opened the door at 7 in the morning. The first customer was an old man who delivered mail along the eastern route and had been stopping in Ferris Creek for years and had opinions about every eating establishment he'd encountered. He came in, sat down, ordered the biscuits and coffee, ate without speaking, and on his way out said, "Better than the last place," and left. She decided to count it. By the end of the first week, she had regulars. Not many, 5, 6, people who had tried it once and made the calculation that they would try it again. Ranchers coming through on the road. A woman who taught at the schoolhouse 2 streets over and came every morning for coffee and a biscuit before the day started. A family passing through with 3 children who ate everything on the table and asked if they could bring the rest of the cornbread with them. She let them have it. By the end of the second week, she was busy at lunch. She was not making money yet, not cleanly, not in a way that left anything over after the costs. But the operation worked. The kitchen worked the way she had designed it to work. The flow she had planned was the flow she used, and nothing fought her. And she understood now, having cooked in other people's kitchens all her adult life, what a significant thing it was to cook in a kitchen that was built for the way you actually move. She wrote in her notebook every evening, not meal plans only, she had always done those, but other things. Observations about the day, notes on what had worked and what hadn't, the faces she'd served and the things they'd said or not said. She was building a record. She didn't know yet what the record was for. She knew she needed to keep it. She thought about Logan with a frequency that she monitored without trying to stop it, because trying to stop thinking about someone is roughly as effective as trying to stop noticing weather. He was there in her mind in the particular way that people are there when you have spent a significant amount of time in close proximity to them, and then stopped. Not painfully, not with urgency, but with a kind of ongoing low-level presence, like a sound in the room you've adjusted to without realizing. She wondered sometimes what he was doing, whether Clint had found a good cook, whether the ceiling repair had held through the rest of the spring, whether he was still sitting at the end of the table nearest the door, taking the coldest seat because no one else wanted it. His letters came every 2 weeks, more or less. Not long. He was not a long letter writer, which was consistent with everything she knew about him. He wrote about the ranch and what was happening on it. The spring cattle work, a fence line that had failed badly after the winter, a new hand who had turned out to be worth keeping. He wrote about the cook Clint had found, a man from up near the Canadian line who was competent but not inspired, and Logan had written competent but not inspired as a plain description without apparent subtext, and she had read it 3 times. He wrote about the east pasture, about the horses, about a late frost in May that had taken out the kitchen garden she hadn't known the ranch had. He did not write about what was between them. Neither did she. It lived in the space around the letters, understood by both parties without requiring articulation, the way some things are better held carefully than examined too often. She had been open 5 months when Dale Cruz walked into Brooks' table on a Thursday morning in October. She was behind the counter when the door opened, and she looked up, and there he was, hat in hand, still with the hat in hand, looking around the front room with the expression of a man who is recalibrating something. "Dale Cruz," she said. "Miss Brooks." He looked at the counter, at the menu board, at the tables. "This is something," he said. "Sit down," she said. "I'll get you coffee." He sat. He ate biscuits, and he ate the bean soup she was running that day, and he ate 2 pieces of cornbread, and when he was done, he sat with the coffee and looked at her across the counter. "Logan sent his regards," he said. "Did he send you?" Dale looked slightly uncomfortable. "He mentioned you were here. I was passing through." He paused. "He didn't send me. I made my own decision." "All right," she said. "He's—" Dale stopped, worked his jaw around the thing. "He's been good this year, running the ranch properly, I mean, out in it like the rest of us. Got rid of 2 more men who weren't worth keeping." Another pause. "He's different, a little, since you left. I don't mean worse, just—" He looked for the word. "More deliberate, maybe." She poured him more coffee without being asked. "How's the ceiling?" she said. Dale looked confused for a second and then understood. "Solid," he said. "Didn't move all winter." She nodded. He left an hour later, and she watched the door close behind him and stood in the front room of her cafe in October with the morning light coming through the windows she'd cleaned last week. She cleaned them every week, because dirty windows change the quality of the light in a room, and the quality of the light matters. And she thought about Logan being more deliberate, and she thought about Dale Cruz making his own decision to stop in, and she thought about what months of distance does to a thing when the thing is real. Distance either kills it or it doesn't. She had learned this before, in other contexts. What distance kills was usually already dying. What distance doesn't kill is something else. Something that has its own structure, its own reasons for persisting, that doesn't require constant proximity to maintain its shape. She thought she knew which category this was. She had known for a while. Logan arrived in Ferris Creek on a Friday in November, which was the first month that Brooks' table had turned a clean profit, which she had noted in her ledger on Thursday evening with the particular satisfaction of a number that means something. She didn't know he was coming. She was in the kitchen at 9 in the morning with the breakfast rush just clearing when the front door opened and she heard the particular footstep. She recognized it before she looked up, which surprised her and also didn't. And she came out from behind the counter and there he was. He looked like himself, which sounds like a simple thing and isn't. He looked exactly like the man she'd been writing letters to, and the man she'd spent a winter with, and the man she'd left. And he looked like all of these were the same person, which they were, and which she had always known, but which was somehow clearer in the doorway of her cafe than it had been anywhere else. He was not wearing his hat. He had it in his hand. "I should have written," he said, "that I was coming." "Yes," she said, "you should have." "I wasn't sure until I was already on the road." She looked at him for a moment. "Sit down," she said. "I'll get you coffee." He sat at the counter and she poured his coffee and set the cup in front of him, and he wrapped both hands around it the way he always did, the burned hand and the other, and she looked at the back of his left hand, and the scar there had faded to a pale line over the past months, but was still visible if you knew to look. "The cafe looks right," he said. "From outside, the sign." "It's not done yet," she said. "The back room still needs—" "It looks right," he said again gently, and she stopped. She looked around her front room. The tables she'd found at the estate sale in April and refinished herself. The chairs that didn't all match, but which she had decided she liked that way, because matching chairs suggest that everyone is the same, and she had good reasons to disagree with that premise. The menu board in her own handwriting, the window with the good light, the smell of the place, which was coffee and bread, and the particular warmth that a kitchen creates when it's been used every day by someone who means it. It looked right. It was hers. She had built it. "I can pay you back the first installment next month," she said. "The November numbers are good." "I know," he said. "I got your ledger summary. I want you to know it's on track." "I know it's on track," he said. He looked at his coffee, then at her. "That's not why I came." "I know that's not why you came," she said. A pause, short, full. "I'm not here to ask you for anything," he said. "I came because—" He stopped. "Because I wanted to see you in this place. That you built. That's yours." He looked around the room. "Because I spent a winter watching you cook in a kitchen that wasn't yours, for people who mostly didn't deserve the effort, and I wanted to see what it looked like when the kitchen was actually yours, and the people coming through the door were coming because they chose to." She stood behind her counter and felt something move in her chest that was not grief and was not just happiness either. It was something more complex, the feeling of being seen not as a project or a possibility, but as a person who had done a specific thing in specific conditions and come out the other side with something to show for it. "Stay for lunch," she said. "I'll make the stew." "The molasses beans?" he said. And there was the smallest thing at the corner of his mouth that she had learned, over a winter of careful observation, was what a smile looked like on Logan Mercer before he was ready to let it be a full one. "If you're lucky," she said. He stayed for lunch. He stayed through the afternoon, helping where she'd let him, sitting out of the way where she wouldn't, and he was good at reading the difference, which she had known he would be. A rancher came in at 2 who wanted to complain about the price of winter feed, and Logan listened to him with the particular focused attention he brought to things that mattered to people even when they didn't matter to him, and the rancher left satisfied in the way that people are satisfied when they feel genuinely heard, and she watched this from the kitchen and thought, there it is. That's the thing about him. That's the thing. In the late afternoon, when the last customer had gone and she was turning the sign and doing the closing work, he stood in the kitchen doorway and watched her move through the space she'd designed. The left-right-center flow, the way nothing fought her, the way her hands knew where everything was without having to think about it. "This is what you were building toward," he said. "Yes," she said, "even back in January, when you were making beans with molasses in a kitchen that had a broken pot handle and a crack in the range. Even then," she said. She wiped down the prep surface and hung the cloth. "You saw that?" "I saw you working like the kitchen was already yours," he said. "Like you were just temporarily in the wrong one." She looked at him in the kitchen doorway of her cafe on a November afternoon with the light going outside and the clean smell of the closed-down day around them, and she thought about what it is to be seen that precisely by another person, not idealized, not managed, not explained to themselves, just seen, with accuracy and without agenda, the way good observation works when there's no ulterior motive underneath it. She thought about all the versions of herself she'd been before this. The girl on the overturned crate reaching her mother's stove. The woman in Butte standing in front of a vendor who thought her size gave him something to say. The cook who had walked into Iron Ridge Ranch in the snow and been laughed at before she'd spoken a word. She thought about every kitchen that had been someone else's, and every table she'd fed people at who would not have let her sit down with them, and she thought about the particular stubbornness that had carried her through all of it. Not bravery. She had always known it wasn't bravery. Just stubbornness dressed in working clothes, showing up every morning and making the coffee and doing the work at the standard she'd set for herself regardless of what the room was doing. That stubbornness was hers. It had always been hers. No one had given it to her, and no one could take it away. And everything she had built, this room, this kitchen, this sign with her name on it, this ledger with its first clean profit month, had come from it, from that particular unbeautiful, persistent refusal to become what the difficult circumstances wanted her to become. And she had done it without becoming hard. That was the thing she was most careful about and most proud of, in the private accounting she kept of herself. The world had given her sufficient reason to become hard, to put a wall around the kitchen and the cookbook and the stubbornness and keep everyone outside it, because outside was where the contempt came from, and outside was where the Restons were, and outside was where the vendors on 2nd Street in Butte were. She had kept the wall from going up. She had kept the door open. Not because openness was easy or safe or reliably rewarded, but because the alternative, the closed kitchen, the defended self, the life lived inside the wall, was a kind of slow poverty she refused. The cafe was the proof of that. People came through the door because the door was open, and they stayed because what was inside was real, and what was inside was real because she had made it that way on purpose, every day, at a standard that didn't depend on whether anyone was watching. "I want to ask you something," Logan said from the doorway. She looked at him. "I'm not asking you to come back to Iron Ridge," he said. "I'm asking if I can come here. Not to stay. I have a ranch that needs running, and I'm not walking away from it. But regular. As regular as the road allows. As whatever you want to call what this is." He held her eyes. "I'm asking for the chance to show you the thing I said I could do. The telling you when it costs me something. I'd like to try doing that in the actual direction of your life rather than across the distance of it." She looked at him standing in the kitchen doorway of what was hers and thought about the letter and the loan and the terms she'd written herself and the ledger with its clean numbers and the biscuits and the molasses and the ceiling he'd repaired and the firebox in the morning and the notebook and the ladle and all of it. The whole weight and texture of what they had been to each other since a January morning in the snow, when he had been the only man in a yard full of laughing men to stay quiet. And she had not known that until now, but she knew it now. "Yes," she said, "you can come here." He nodded. He did not make it more than it was, which was one of the things she trusted most about him. "I'll need to eat something before I ride back," he said. "I know," she said. "Sit down, I'll make the beans." She lit the range. She opened the pantry, her pantry, with her system, everything where she'd put it. And she got the beans and the molasses and the salt pork, and she started the pot, and Logan sat on the stool she kept by the kitchen wall and wrapped his hands around his coffee cup, and the kitchen filled with the smell of something that had been made carefully for a person who was worth the care. Outside, the November dark came down over Ferris Creek, and the sign above the door of Brooks' table held its ground against the wind. And somewhere in the warm interior of the cafe, a woman who had been laughed at and talked about and underestimated by nearly every room she'd ever walked into was cooking a meal in her own kitchen, by her own standard, for someone who had spent a winter learning to see her right. She was not a simple woman, and her life was not a simple story, and it was not finished yet, not by a long way. There was the second installment to Logan, and the back room she still hadn't fixed, and the winter menu she needed to plan, and the teacher who came every morning for coffee and had mentioned once, carefully, that she was saving up for something, and Hazel had not asked what because the woman would say when she was ready. There was all of that and more, the ordinary, complicated, ongoing matter of a life being lived in full. But she was here, in this kitchen, with this cookbook on the shelf and this notebook beside it, and this person on the stool, and she had arrived at this particular moment by the particular route she had taken. No shortcuts, no smooth roads, nothing handed to her that she hadn't also had to carry, and she thought her mother would have recognized it, would have seen it in the handwriting of the thing, in the quality of the attention it had required. The beans came to a simmer. She added the molasses. What the world had called her size, her history, her lack of credentials and connections, and the right kind of past, all of it had been offered to her as reasons why she couldn't. She had taken those reasons and made them into fuel, the same way you take the tough end of a thing and cook it low and slow until it gives up everything it has. She had given up nothing. She had kept going, and the kitchen smelled of molasses and possibility. And outside the sign held its ground, and inside the fire was lit, and it was enough. It was, at last, exactly